cash increase is significant. What I mean is that at $5,000 a child, you can provide a very good education. At $6,000 a child, or 7 or 8, it gets exponentially better. Therefore, the cost of buildings, teachers, flights, education supplies, housing for teachers at the lower end of expatriate schools is much more challenging than it is at the higher end. We have a range of educational facilities in Qatar, verging from, I would say, reasonably priced up to the American School of Doha, which is about $25,000 a year. So what are the solutions? The solutions are twofold. One, that the companies pick up the education bill for their employees. And this, I fear, is quite a challenge for companies, that they are expected not only to pay their employees, but also pay for their housing and the education. And at the moment, for example, it is half the price to employ a British person in Britain than it is to employ a British person in Qatar. And that is a challenge for companies. And the other solution is for the government to take on the provision of education across different nationalities and in different languages. And I would say, with my experience, that is an impossible task. I don't think that it could be achieved, that the Ministry of Education here could open a variety of schools in different languages, in different curriculums. I think it would just be impossible. So there is something in the middle which is the way to achieve this, which is to let the free market dominate the education space, because it is where most, for the expatriates, I mean, because it is where most of them send their children. And the thing to be very wary of then is that education is very big business, and there are unethical educational operators that can move with significant muscle to dominate developing education spaces. And therefore, there needs to be a variety of government control over a free market. And again, that is extremely challenging as well. At the top end, educational facilities will police themselves, and there is a certain amount of choice, and parents can choose because they have the ability to choose. And they can choose their curriculum and they can choose their provider. At the lower end, which is more of a volume market, it is much easier for education operators to dominate the education space with practices that would generally be frowned upon. And of course, then when this happens, one naturally turns to the government that have made a decision for the free education market to exist, to control, which is exactly against what the education market and the parents want. So it is very much the expatriates demanding or wishing for a totally free education space, but with an amount of government control. And I feel that also is an impossible task for the Ministry of Education here. So the solution is to build a private education office at the Ministry of Education that has the capability to be able to properly control private education establishments in Qatar, and that is developing. It is an incredibly difficult process, and there have been some challenges from the Ministry of Education and the Supreme Education Council before that have achieved, but we are getting there. The main issue as we unlock the chains that have restricted education operators in Qatar is, we'll go back to the extraordinary price of land and the extraordinary price of housing. And when one seeks to control artificially the price of education, of course, what schools cannot control is the price of where their teachers live and the price of the land that the schools are built on. Now, the government has moved quite definitively to action this, and there used to be an amount of government schools attached to embassies, and now the government has acted with countries to build state schools in different languages, and I see a Palestinian and Sudanese schools that are opening relatively soon. We have Finnish, German, French. So we are getting there, but of course an education facility takes 2 years to build and 2 or 3 years to open and operate. So we've been in this space for about 25 years. It is much better, but it is not great, but it is getting much better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we will now move to our last speaker, Dr. Izzeldin Bakit from Community College, Qatar.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So I'm going to discuss the topic of increasing cost of living in Qatar. And I mean, from the 3 previous speakers, you could imagine that they made my presentation easier because they talked about education and housing. So these are probably the 2 major cost components. And we all know that the total population in Qatar is currently about 2.5 million people, out of which are about 280 Qataris, accounting for a little less than 15% of the total population. So, of course, then a little more than 2 million are expatriates. And the World Bank reported in 2015 that the state of Qatar has the highest per capita income in the world, accounting for $140,000, which is equivalent to a little more than 500,000 riyals per year. So, strong growth and economic expansion has attracted foreign workers and professionals to Qatar, and that made Qatar an alluring place to work in. Nonetheless, cost of living in Qatar are steadily increasing, and that will result in corroding the earnings and investments or savings of people. And of course, it will affect the image of Qatar as an attractive place to work and live in. Just to give an idea, through a few of statistics and comparisons between Qatari nationals and expats, I based my statistics on the Ministry of Development Planning statistics, particularly on a publication on household expenditure, income, and survey in 2013. I mean, the figures are current, and they are very indicative of the current situation now in Qatar. They surveyed about 4,000 households. Half of them is Qataris, and half of them is expatriates. So, in the findings of this report, it is stated that the average Qatari household earns about 73,000 Qatari riyals per month, and the average expat household income is about 25,000 riyals. I mean, of course, this is Qatar. It's for Qatari nationals, but at the same time, this report or the survey indicates that the Qatari household is made of about 8 to 9 persons, while the expats household is on average about 4 to 5 people living in that household. But when taking into account housing and free electricity and water, the Qatari income figure increases to about 88,000 riyals per year. So the figures also show that the Qatari household spends an average about 50,000 riyals a month, while the average expat household spends about 18,000 riyals. So in percentages, the spending or expenditures of the Qataris are about 21% of their income, and the expats about 35% of their income. That's their spending. Additionally, there was an indication that in the past 7 years, there was a little bit slower increase in expenditure than in the period between 2001 and 2007. So these figures, just to conclude, they tell us that the expat's household spends about 1/3 of their monthly, I mean, if from the statistics we have seen here, about 1/3 of their monthly income only on housing. So another important component of spending for expats is transportation and communications. I mean, we know either to buy a car or rent a car or a driver with a car, and communication as well. I mean, we know cell phones and so on. So that is another considerable component. And this generally, we can say from the previous statistics that the cost of living in Qatar has been increasing steadily in the last 10 to 15 years. This has been summarized in what we call the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, which is actually an indicator of the average cost of living. At the same time, it is a measure for inflation in an economy. So the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index in Qatar, has been also relatively high, or it is probably the highest in the GCC. It accounts for about 4% currently. That means from month to month, there is an increase in the expenditure of a basket of needs for a household, every month, an increase of 4%. Okay, there are a couple of items here, like traveling abroad, personal care, education, medical care, housing, and so on. These are all items that are, considered as considerable components of expenditures, and at the same time, their prices have been increasing steadily. Once again, just to summarize that the cost of living, the cost of housing, the education, transportation and communications, but also the other items I just spoke about, they have been increasing steadily. And this leads us to the conclusion that all of those indicators tell us that the cost of living is increasing, and that affects the earnings and savings of expatriates here in Qatar. One of the things that I just would like to conclude my presentation about is that due to the upcoming World Cup event, there is an estimation from the Ministry of Development and Planning Statistics that the cost of living and inflation will peak in the period between 2016 and 2019. So within the 3 years, because of construction, because also of increasing number of new residents coming into Qatar, that will lead those two factors, the construction needs for the World Cup and the increase in population will result in higher CPI or inflation in Qatar, increase in the cost of living generally by 18%. And this might make it actually will eat into and corrode the savings and earnings of people living in Qatar and may actually lead to changing the image of Qatar as an attractive place to come and work with. So there are a couple of solutions I think my colleagues here spoke about. Some of them is people started already moving into Doha suburban areas like Wakra and some other cities or towns here in Qatar. There are some solutions for education and so on. But certainly, particularly within this period, something needs to be done in order to keep inflation in check. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Just before opening up to the floor, I just had one quick question for Niall. I think a theme underpinning your presentation was multiculturalism and dealing with diversity. I'm sure you've had your own experiences of that in the UK. I was wondering if maybe you could say something on either the difference or similarities between managing and planning for that diversity or multiculturalism within the educational setting in the UK and in Qatar.
Of course. I think it's probably easier to address that globally. I think it's a given that everyone wants their children to be educated up to the age of 18, which is roughly university entrance, and schools anywhere in the world should provide that. I think more and more people also realise that whatever language and whatever nationality you are, your children also need to be deployable in English. And with the internet, with the international language of business being English, the battle now is to get to the stage where your child at 18 is not only educationally excellent in your own language, but also in English as well. And that is the balance. Of course, for us in the UK, that's really easy because that is our language. Our points into multiculturalism are generally most of our expatriates do. What a lot of the Qataris do here is that they do English at school and their own language and culture at home. It's not always a great solution, and especially for the less well paid, it is often more of a challenge, especially if their mothers aren't at home, they're out working. The solutions, I think, are relatively simple, and if we look to the smaller European countries, we can see these. Scandinavia, Denmark, Holland are sending all of their children to university, furiously nationalistic and knowledgeable about